Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to be teaching you guys a trap in the Jobava London, which nobody talks about, and it does not involve knight b5. Okay, so if your opponents play a6 or c6 or c5, basically stopping knight b5 ideas, this is the perfect trap. This very line has helped me be a national master, multiple 2100s and up, and so it definitely works, I can tell you that. And let's get started. And nobody really talks about this line, so even better, right? Less people are familiar with it. If your opponent plays a6, okay, or c6 or c5 or really fucking anything, you're gonna play e3, and basically the prerequisite for this line to work is your opponent needs to play bishop f5 and then e6. Okay, so if your opponent plays e6 instead and locks his own bishop, right, inside his own pawn chain, then it's like, okay, well, you can't do the trap anymore because your opponent's just a fucking idiot. All right. Now, I'm not saying everybody who plays e6 before bringing the bishop out is an idiot, but for the purpose of this video, I will be saying that. Knight f3, e6. Okay, now you play knight e5, and here your opponent has, again, a million different moves. In fact, he can play a6 if he hasn't already. He can play c6, he can play c5, knight d7, bishop d6, bishop e7. But the two most critical moves are knight d7 and bishop d6. If your opponent plays like literally anything else, like let's say c6, you're already going to be winning just because of g4. But yeah, knight bd7. And by the way, we're going to look at knight bd7 and bishop d6. Those are the two most critical moves. But you also have to remember that knight c6 and knight bd7, they will always transpose into each other. It's just that knight bd7 technically is more flexible for black since it keeps the c5 push open. But these lines will always transpose into each other. So whether you see knight c6, knight bd7, or sorry, knight bd7, then you don't have to worry. You're going to play the same thing. Let's start with knight bd7 because I feel like that's the most common move. You're going to play g4 here, okay? And your opponent, once again, has multiple options. But one of the most common ones is bishop g6. And bishop g6 is already almost immediately losing. Like, you will have an advantage from this position. Now, before we look at bishop g6, let's just quickly look at what happens if knight takes e5, okay? So knight takes e5 is probably the best move that black has at his disposal. And here you have two options. You can take either the knight or the bishop. Now, in this case, you're going to want to take the bishop, and then your opponent's going to go to c6 or d7. Like I said, it doesn't really matter. You're going to take on e6, and now your opponent has a backwards e-pawn. So if your opponent plays this way, then you don't really have any trap. You don't really win anything. But your opponent has a bad pawn structure, okay? And even though the engine says it's equal, I don't care. You're not playing an engine. You're playing a human being. And defending this backwards pawn is always going to be a hassle for black. So long term, I would say that white has a preferable position here, okay? But what I've noticed is most people don't take this knight, especially in lower time controls. Most people just go bishop d6. And here you're going to play h4. And the idea is that, well, if your opponent plays knight takes c5 now, right, and then goes to d7, h5 actually traps his bishop. Bishop e4, f3. Okay, and this bishop is trapped, and you end up winning this bishop. Now, of course, after knight takes c5, d takes c5, d4 is possible, and this makes things a little bit more complicated. Because, let's just say, e takes d4, right? Knight d5. Okay, now this bishop's under attack, so h5 cannot be played. If you go like bishop, I don't know, g3, for example, then you already have, I mean, knight take, oh, that's not what I meant to play. You already have knight takes c3, b takes c3, and then something like queen d5. And I mean, h5 here doesn't work at all because you lose your rook, right? So that's something you have to be careful with. If your opponent does this and then plays d4, your opponent knows what he's doing, you're going to take on d4. And then after knight d5, you can either play bishop g2 and go into this like super complicated line where you sack a bishop and then you get, you know, a weird sort of position with queen d2. This works really well, but it's kind of complicated and there's a lot of moves that your opponent can go through. So the most simple thing you can do is play knight takes d5, you know, queen takes d5, and then just play rook g1, and you're up a pawn, okay? And you know, you're gonna play bishop e3 to protect this pawn. Fucking queen e2 or queen d2, long castle, and you're going to be up a pawn for the rest of the game in a very, very comfortable position. So long castle, bishop e3, queen e2, long castle, and you're good. Okay. Now so far we've looked at the most critical responses that black has, right? But most of your opponents aren't gonna play the most critical responses. At least I would hope. And in fact, you know, a national master against me played h5 in this position. Okay. So what I'm trying to say is that there's a lot of potential in this line, and I did not mean to mess up my hair like that, but it's whatever. We're going to keep going. Now, once we get to after h4, okay, and if your opponent doesn't play knight takes c5, he has two moves. He has h6 or h5, because if he doesn't play knight takes c5 or these two moves, and plays like, I don't know, bishop e7, Like I said, he's going to lose his bishop. Bishop e4, f3. Bishop has no legal moves. He's going to have to sacrifice on f3. You win the bishop. All right, simple as that. So your opponent has to play either h6 or h5, right? And those two moves are pretty similar in how you're going to respond, but there are some important details that you have to basically consider and respond to accordingly. For example, h5, hold on. h5, knight takes g6, f takes g6. The reason this is so good is because typically, if you were to capture this bishop, your opponent would be able to respond by recapturing the h-pawn. But now that the h-pawn has been pushed, he has to respond by capturing the f-pawn, effectively ruining his own pawn structure, doubling the g-pawns, and making this e6 pawn a backwards pawn, also weakening the king. So if h5 happens, you're going to take on g6, f takes g6, and then you're going to play g5, kicking this knight out. Now, your opponent has a couple of moves. He cannot go to g4, okay? Because then you play f3 and trap this knight. Very simple. If he goes to e4, then you can play queen d3. And if something like bishop b4, for example, you can play f3, you know, bishop takes e3, b takes e3, I don't know, knight d6, you have queen takes g6, okay? So you're going to be completely winning. If after f3, knight takes c3, b takes c3, and then, I don't know, bishop a5, once again, you have queen takes g6, you're completely winning. This king cannot castle. You're up a pawn. You're up 2 pawns, okay? And this king is just super, super weak. You can go king d2 if you really need to, or you can just, honestly, you're probably going to be able to castle with no problems, and you're going to be completely winning. Right. So after g5, most people are going to go to h7 or g8. That doesn't really matter, whichever choice they make. You're going to play queen d3 anyway. And with queen d3, you're obviously looking at g6, right? So your opponent has to play king f7 in order to protect this pawn. That's the only move he has to actually protect g6, which is to move his king. And this should be, like, this alone should be enough reason for you to want to play this line, because as you can see here, this is an absolutely atrocious position for black. And I need to put some product in my hair. It looks like I'm balding, and maybe I am balding, but I mean, it doesn't stop this line from becoming, or it doesn't change the fact that this line is amazing, right? You're going to play bishop h3 here, or you can play e4. In fact, you have a lot of moves available to you, but I like to start with bishop h3 because sometimes there are potential sacrifices with bishop takes e6. For example, let's just say your opponent plays c5 here, okay? You can long castle, you can short castle, or you can take on e6. King takes e6, okay? Well, I mean, there's also d takes c5, but queen takes g6, and now your opponent, if he decides to go to e7, will get checkmated with bishop d6, right? Or even knight takes d5. Those are both checkmates. So he has to respond by playing knight f6. Either one, actually. He can move maybe this one. And you recapture your lost piece. And as you can see, this king on e6 is extremely weak. So the position is +7 or +6.5. I mean, this is about as good as it gets, right? In the early middle game, this king is in the fucking middle of the board, and your queen's next to him. Doesn't get better than that. Okay, so I like bishop h3 now. It doesn't necessarily mean I have to sacrifice right away, and it doesn't mean your opponent plays c5. Your opponent can play a multitude of moves, like bishop b4, for example. And here you can play, well, again, you still have bishop takes e6, and this is a totally valid line. Or you can play e4, or you can long castle. You have a million different moves, but basically, at some point you're going to play e4, and at some point you're going to long castle, and you're going to want to open this position up. You're going to give him various checks, and you're going to exploit all of these weaknesses. So this alone is an amazing position, and I don't really need to give you any theory. In fact, there isn't any theory in this position because there's no, like, set move. Holy shit, I'm actually balding. Give me a second here. Okay, we're back. I'm no longer balding, but there is no, like, specific move order that you have to follow here. All you need to know is that you're going to open up the position with e4. You're going to long castle because short castling is kind of stupid considering, you know, your entire king side is going to be exposed. You're going to connect these rooks, and you're going to blast open the position, and basically your opponent is fucked. Okay, that's it. You're going to win this game. Now, if your opponent plays h6, things go a little bit differently, because notice that after knight takes g6, f takes g6, playing g5 doesn't really work. I mean, you can still get away with it, but after h takes g5, you cannot do h takes g5 because then you lose your rook, okay? You have to do bishop g5. This isn't nearly as good, and you're wasting your opportunities here. So if h6, right? And once again, I'll remind you guys, if h5, you go g5 here. With h6, after knight takes g6, f takes g6, instead of playing g5, you're going to play bishop d3. And the idea is, well, it's the same fucking idea. If your opponent plays g5 here, you have bishop g6, you can force your opponent to e7, and then you can actually play hg5 because, well, hg5 would lose your opponent the rook. Anyway, most times your opponent's not going to play g5. I don't even know why I brought that up. Most of the time you're going to go and face king f7 because, again, your opponent has to protect this g6 pawn, and that's the only way to do it. And to respond to this, you're going to play queen f3. So now you have potential discovered checks. And your idea with queen f3 is that you're going to long castle, and then you're going to play g5. And that's going to open up a million different opportunities for you. For example, your opponent here can play something like bishop b4. That is not something you have to worry about. You're going to long castle. Your opponent can take this knight, ruin your pawn structure. It doesn't fucking matter, okay? Queen e7, g5. This knight cannot move. This knight cannot move. Because if he goes knight h7, you have a discovered check with bishop d6, okay? And bishop d6, discovered check on the king, and you win the queen, right? So if after g5 your opponent takes, and I don't know, you go hg5, all of a sudden, right, you're now losing a rook. So that's why g5 works now, because you've long castled, and the queen on f3 is super strong. Your opponent can try like queen a3 here, but your king just goes to d2, and actually he's completely safe. Like, you have this little like house over your king, and again, your opponent in this position still cannot move this knight. I mean, he can go to e4, but before we get to that, let's say he tries rook takes h1, right? And then something like knight g8. You once again have bishop d6, discovered check, and now you're winning the queen. Is just the bishop is going backwards. So that limits your opponent's options by a lot. He has to go knight e4 check, takes, right? Queen takes e4. Here, obviously, bishop d6 doesn't work because you just lose the queen like an idiot. Like, yeah, you win it back, but you didn't gain anything from this. And your opponent equalizes. You take on e4, and now you're just going to slowly start chipping away at your opponent's pawns because his position absolutely sucks. You can take on c7. If your opponent takes on a2, you can go bishop d6, or you can just, like, I mean, you can straight up take on b7 right now, but let's just say you go to d6, force the rook to g8, go to f3, win on the pawn on b7. You don't even have to give this check. You can just take on b7 right away, and, you know, if something like rook d8, you have rook a1, I don't know, queen d5, queen takes d5, e takes d5, rook a6, you're up 3 pawns. Okay, it's move 24, you're up 3 pawns. You have 0 positional disadvantage in this position. There's no compensation for your opponent, and you're up 3 entire pawns, okay? And 2 of your opponent's pawns are doubled, all right? And blockaded by your g5 pawn. So this is literally a dream position. I mean, if you could get to this position every time as white, chess would be solved a million years ago, okay? So really simple stuff. You're just going to go to f3, and you're basically going to long castle and then play g5 at some point. That's your entire goal. And if this king, you know, goes to, I mean, yeah, you know, your opponent really doesn't have anything. Like, regardless, you're going to be winning material. And even if it's not a piece straight up, you're just going to win multiple pawns. And the important thing in this line that I've noticed is you're not really looking for a checkmate. There are some positions where you could potentially checkmate your opponent, but most of the time you're looking to win material. And sometimes it doesn't have to be in the form of pieces. It can just be in the form of free pawns, because your opponent's pieces are going to be uncoordinated, and they're going to be placed in a manner where they're forced to protect the king, okay? Which typically means that, you know, multiple of your opponent's pawns are going to be left unattended. All right, that covers h6, right? All really simple stuff. What about, instead of knight b7, bishop d6, okay? Well, we're still going to play g4 here, but our responses have to be very measured and slightly different. For example, if bishop takes e5 here, and I want you to recall at the start, I showed you guys that if knight b7 and then knight takes e5, we could take on f5 and ruin our opponent's pawn structure, right? We cannot do this here, because if we go g takes f5, bishop takes f4, whose pawn structure is actually ruined, you know? We have the worst pawn structure because we're also down a pawn. So that doesn't make sense at all. Also, this e4 square is absolutely amazing for our opponent. He can go knight e4 at some point, and, you know, we're going to be in some trouble. I mean, I guess we have f3, but at the same time, this position sucks for white. There's no reason to go for this. Instead, you're going to do d takes e5, and you're actually going to sacrifice this g-pawn. And what that means is, yes, you're down a pawn temporarily, but you get a ton of counterplay, and a lot of the time, you're probably going to be winning some material. Here you play f3. Okay, you want to kick this knight out. You don't want to play something like rook h1 because of g5. That's not something you want to deal with. You're going to play f3. And again, I mean, I guess your opponent can play g5 here, but in this case, you can take on g4, and, you know, g takes f4. You can't actually take this bishop because then you run into queen h4, and that's a lot of trouble. So you have to play h4 first. But after something like bishop g6, I mean, you have h5 already, and, you know, f takes e3, h takes g6, f takes g6, you know, queen d3. The material is technically equal. Your opponent has 3 extra pawns, but you're up a piece. But you're gonna win this e3 pawn real soon, and then you're gonna castle, and this position is again very good for white, and you should be winning it. So instead of g5, most people are just gonna go to h6. Now you don't want to be preemptive and take this knight, and oh, I can ruin black's pawn structure as well. You don't need to do that. All you need to do is play h4, and the reason we're playing h4 in this position is because we want to stop queen h4. By playing h4, we put a pawn here. If the queen was to take, our rook would be able to recapture. When the pawn is on h2, if the queen goes to h4, nothing can really attack this queen except for bishop g3. But we don't want to go through these motions, so we're going to play h4. Now, your opponent can mess up so easily here. For example, if your opponent just castles here, you'll already have e4, okay? D takes c4, queen takes d8, rook takes d8, f takes e4. If your opponent goes to g6, you can play h5, and the bishop's trapped. You win a bishop, okay? That's pretty awesome, right? But if your opponent goes to, like, bishop g4, you can just play rook g1. And it looks like your opponent's able to escape by playing bishop h5, but actually, you can play bishop takes h6, and your opponent cannot take because, well, the king or the pawn is pinned to the king. So, very simple, very easy to mess up for your opponent. He has to play something like knight c6 here, and then you can play queen d2, and you can prepare more attacks. And at some point, you're going to long castle and just play e4. And so having this extra pawn for black doesn't actually give him that much of, or it actually doesn't give him anything. White has the advantage here because especially if your opponent castles at any point, you can long castle here, and then you can prepare e4, or you can prepare rook g1 and taking this knight and various stacks along the open g file. Having this open g file at the cost of a pawn is a blessing if your opponent chooses to castle kingside. Now, if your opponent chooses to not castle kingside, play something like f6. You just have e takes f6, queen takes f6, long castle. Your pieces are far more developed, and after something like, if your opponent chooses to long castle here, you just play bishop g5. And I guess, like, it's unlikely that this very specific line is going to occur. But what I'm saying is your pieces are so much more active that in any line, there's going to be a lot of counterplay for you. Like, just in this very specific situation, you're already winning an exchange. You're already at a solid advantage. Queen e5, bishop takes d8, rook takes d8, knight e2, okay? You're going to play bishop g2, you might play e4, or you might play knight d4. You're good, right? So this is basically the entire variation that I wanted to show you guys. It's a really nice line, okay? Nobody really talks about this. It's very uncommon. I don't know that many people who play the Jobava line in the first place, but very few people actually go for this g4 line. And, it really is only possible thanks to the innovation of engines, because if you try playing this in like the 1960s or something, you would get ganged up on by like an Azerbaijani diaspora in your local chess club and kicked out for playing, pushing your kingside pawns in the early stages of the game, because nobody used to do this, right? But with the innovation of engines, we have the ability to play bullshit like this and get away with it. So go out there, play g4, study some of these lines, go a little bit more in depth. I'm giving you guys just the kind of opening, the meaty parts, but there's a million different things that your opponent can play, and it doesn't necessarily even have to start with a6. It could be with c6 or c5. There are slight variations with each of those, or slight changes with each of those variations, but for the most part, the ideas stay the same, and that's what I intended to show with this video. It's not to teach you every single possible line. That's not feasible. It's to show you the ideas and the strategies and the middle game plans of this line. So if you found this video useful, which I hope you did, leave a comment. Please like and subscribe. If you want to see me play live, I do that on Twitch. The link is in the description. I do that basically almost every single day. And yeah, I thank you everybody so much for watching. I will be going back to regularly scheduled uploads of my games, and I will see you all tomorrow.
Белый снег, серый лед.